Thank you, Scott, and thank you for the gentle nudge to unmute myself. So, hi, everyone. I'm glad you could join us again this evening for our third and final panel discussion in our series of discussions celebrating our 70th anniversary. Just a little bit of sort of housekeeping. So, if you're joining us, you can see the panelists, but we can't see you. So if you are worried about your camera being on, don't be. We can't see you. We have a name of the people who are the names of the people who have joined us, but we can't see you if you're sitting in front of a laptop. So not to worry about that. And if you have comments you'd like to leave or questions you'd like to ask of the participants, there is a chat. We're hoping to leave some time at the end for a little bit of discussion and to answer some of your questions or to follow up on a few pieces. So if you leave questions in the chat, then we'll see those and be able to loop back to those at the end of our evening, of our hour here together. My name's Rebecca Webb. I am the Executive Director here at KW Counselling. My pronouns are she and her. So welcome tonight. I'm really thrilled that you could join us. I'm going to start with our Indigenous Land Acknowledgement, which is a nice one to do today because we've got National Indigenous Peoples Day is coming up this weekend, Sunday. So it's very important to us as a first step towards reconciliation that we acknowledge the truth that we are working on land that is a traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples, and on the Haldeman Tract, which runs almost 10 kilometers deep on either side of the Grand River. There's some great virtual National Indigenous Peoples Day events coming up this weekend, so I want to encourage everyone to check those out. Like I mentioned, this is the last of our 3 panels, so we're hoping that the community has found them of value and enjoyed these. We've certainly had a really great time doing it. As I mentioned, this is part of our 70th anniversary sort of celebration, and we wanted to bring people together and answer some questions that a lot of, and certainly that we're hearing from the community and from our clients, that our partners are hearing from the community and our clients, to see sort of, what's our community facing right now? How can we speak to that? How can we provide a little bit of guidance during this time? And also, I think for me, a huge part of this has been, it is a difficult time, to be certain. The system of supports that we have is not perfect. The mental health system that we are working in is not perfect. It is very reassuring to me that we have got such bright, dedicated, talented, deep thinking, deep feeling human beings doing the work to serve our community and adapting to this and sort of switching direction as they need to switch direction to meet the need that's in front of us and be able to serve our community here and now and in this moment. And I personally find that very, very reassuring. So it is our great pleasure to be able to shine a bit of a light on some of the people doing fantastic work right now in our community. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rosie Del Campo to introduce the people on our panel this evening.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And as Rebecca mentioned, if you have a question for one of our panelists, feel free to write it in the chat part of your screen, and eventually we hope to get to some of those questions. And as Rebecca mentioned as well, this is a really difficult time for us when you think about how nerve-wracking it is to go, on a first date or the first day of a new job. This is our first global pandemic. So we are facing really unique challenges, especially when it comes to our mental health. And I know some of our panelists tonight are going to share some answers that might help you, or they might help someone you love, and it might give you a little bit more hope when you walk away from this web session tonight. So I'd like to start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about their roles in the community. So let's start with Lisa.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Rebecca and Rosie. That was a great welcome to all of us. I'm Lisa Akey. I'm the Director of Counseling with Carizon, and I also lead the centralized intake for the Counseling Collaborative, which is the 6 nonprofit counseling agencies in Waterloo region, which includes our friends at KW Counseling, and I'm also a family mediator.
Thank you, Lisa. And we'd like to welcome Helen tonight.
Hi, everybody. I'm Helen Fishburn. I'm the Executive Director at the Canadian Mental Health Association, Waterloo-Wellington. We serve kids, adults, seniors, have some specialized programs like early psychosis and eating disorders, and do a lot of mental health and promotion work across the community as well. And I get to work with many of the great partners around this computer screen. So it's an honor to be here with everybody.
And next we have Jen.
And I'm Jen Forristal. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I spend a lot of my practice working with families on parenting, as well as a lot of youth mental health work. And I'm also the founder of the Umbrella Project, which is a curriculum that runs in a lot of the schools in this area and across Ontario, teaching positive coping skills that we can learn even before we need them to deal with the challenges that we inevitably face in life.
Thanks, Jen. Our next panelist is Christine.
Hello, I'm Christine Purdon. I'm at the University of Waterloo in the Department of Psychology. I am the Director of Clinical Training for our PhD program in Clinical Psychology. And through that, I'm very heavily involved with our Center for Mental Health Research, which provides services for children, adolescents, and adults in the community. And our services are low cost. And I also do research on anxiety.
And finally, we have Washington with us tonight.
My name is Washington. I use they, them pronouns. I work at Kitchener-Waterloo Counselling, and I coordinate the OK to Me program that supports LGBTQ youth. I'm a public educator and therapist in the program.
Thank you to all of our panelists. We'll start by asking each panelist a question, and we'll start with Christine. So Christine, we can all agree this pandemic, a very highly stressful event, but what can you tell us when it comes to the difference between, stress and an actual anxiety disorder?
I think that's such a good question, because this pandemic hit out of the blue. And as you said, this is our first pandemic. If we think back to March 15th or so, we didn't know what was going to happen. Everything was so new, and we had to pivot everything to this new reality of working at home or losing our jobs or working at home with children, et cetera. And that is extremely stressful. So objectively speaking, that is very stressful. And it's very normal to feel quite anxious and on edge and worried when the world changes so rapidly in such a negative direction in so many different ways. And when there's such a real fear for the health and well-being of our loved ones. And so I think that first of all, we want to be compassionate with ourselves, that it's okay to feel stressed. This is a stressful time. But it's such a good question. What is stress? Like a sort of natural reaction to highly stressful events. And when does it move into something that's a bit more problematic for people? And I would say that the big difference is sort of like the difference between a really bad cold and a very, very bad pneumonia. That stress is where you're not yourself, you're not feeling well, you're worried about things. When it starts to become really problematic, it's more like it's all day, every day, 2 weeks or more, where you're having a really hard time meeting your obligations as a parent or as an employee, or social obligations, et cetera. And where the anxiety, it interferes with this in a really significant way all day, every day. So I think if people are feeling very, very distressed, very anxious all the time for a prolonged period of time, that's a time to seek help.
So Christine, how can we avoid burnout from stress?
So it's a second marathon, or maybe our third marathon with this. And as I said, the stress is a natural reaction to a very stressful environment. But I think that there are some things we can do to help ourselves avoid getting burnt out from the stress. And I would say the first thing to keep in mind is that anxiety and stress cause us to become very threat sensitive, and to really be very attentive and focused on threat. And that's a good reaction if you need to, if the threat is immediate, like a bear in your backyard, that you walk out and there's a bear, your threat system will help you adapt to that. But when the threat is more vague and uncertain and prolonged like this, what happens is our attention and our capacity are focused on sort of these, again, these vague, non-immediate, non-concrete kinds of things, and we can't do anything about it. There's very little we can do about it. So I would say that one of the first things that we can do is try to break out of the COVID environment. And by that, I mean, try to avoid spending, chasing news, chasing information on social media, following the news. Take 2 news breaks a day to get updated and get acquainted with what's the most recent stuff is, but then try to take real physical breaks from and go do something in your physical environment that you can control. You know, go do some weeding if you have a garden, go for a walk, pet your children, listen to some music. The second thing I would say is that when we reach out to each other, we need to keep in mind that moods are very contagious. So if we reach out to people and we're very, very stressed, and they're very stressed, we can sort of escalate each other, and we can leave a conversation feeling not enriched and validated, but more anxious and upset. And so I think that what we want to do when we reach out to people is absolutely seek the support that we need from other people, but try to move our conversation along to non-COVID. So again, breaking out of the COVID bubble and move into trying to relate to people the way we used to relate back before COVID. So talking about music or things that you used to have in common. And then I would say the final thing is that yes, it's very stressful, but it's still okay to enjoy the small pleasures in life. So really enjoy a pretty flower, really enjoy petting your animals. Whatever it is that gives you pleasure, allow yourself to enjoy that despite the COVID crisis.
Thanks, Christine. Do any of our panelists have something that they would like to add? All right, then we'll move on to the next question. This is for Washington. Washington, what effect has this pandemic had on people already living with depression or anxiety or addictions or substance abuse issues?
Yeah, I think that's a really great and interesting question. And I think that there's no one answer that covers that experience. There are many folks that I'm supporting right now who have lived experience of depression and anxiety for many years. And sometimes they're like, yeah, I'm pretty used to this. Like, I know what it's like to stay at home. I got this covered. I have these skills. I know how to, I know how to support myself. I know myself well. And then I also think that there are people who this is really exacerbated, made it worse for them. Their support systems are gone. There's increased anxiety about going outside, about making contact with people, and like knowing that you have a community, that you're safe and you belong is so incredibly important. And when we feel alienated from that, it has a huge impact on us. There was also, before the pandemic was happening, for like millennials in many ways were considered the loneliest generation, with some of the highest rates of anxiety and depression being diagnosed. And from a lot of my peers that I see a lot of like self-reflection around who actually is their community, who's an acquaintance versus a friend. And I think it's caused a lot of people to take stock of their life and figure out genuinely like what they need for their well-being. I think it's also meant that like people reach out, not necessarily like right when they should, but maybe when things get a little bit too far, to crisis lines and to like, so we're doing a single session at KW counseling. And before the walk-in clinic, I would see a lot less of people who are in crisis. And now I think with single session, people are presenting more that way. With substance use and addiction, like I think there's a big shift where at home, we don't have to drive, we don't have to necessarily worry about the stigma of people seeing us engage in substance use. So I think that it's become a way to numb out, a way to not have to deal with our feelings, and it for folks that cope that way, you know, there's less access to AA groups and counseling and reaching out for help. So I think substance use is like significantly on the rise. And in particular, like, you know, there's more socially acceptable substance use and like less socially acceptable. And for people who are using opiates, I think there's a significant increase in drug overdoses and deaths. Before we would talk about, you know, don't use alone. But now if people are supposed to isolate and stay in place, people are using alone. I think people are also being taken advantage of in this situation for lots of different reasons, including like domestic violence. So I think it's pretty complicated. I think the ways that people reach out for support have drastically changed, which is really obvious. But in terms, we talk about how you know, the second wave of the pandemic will be a mental health one, and I think that's true because a lot of people are sort of still bracing. And when we come out of it, I think we're going to have to learn how to retrust our community and learn to really listen to ourselves and what we need.
In Washington, are there specific mental health challenges when it comes to more vulnerable people in our community? So for example, the LGBTQ community or even the elderly?
Yeah, absolutely. So like, as I mentioned, community is a huge part of people's well-being, and that's very true in the LGBTQ community. Often people in my community will refer to the community, in fact, as chosen family. It is that important. And when you're cut off from that, it can have a huge impact on people's well-being. I must say that OKWME and Spectrum have done a very good job of moving programming online, but it's not what everybody needs. But for people that weren't connected to the community, I think it is a very difficult time. Like, for the young people that I'm supporting, their GSAs in schools were the only time that they were able to be out and supportive for our youth group. And the schools GSAs aren't happening anymore, and our youth group has moved online. And so you could be stuck at home, not able to be out, or if you are out, perhaps very unsupportive family members, then you can't escape it. So that will have a significant impact on people's well-being. And for seniors, like, I think seniors, again, similar to millennials in some way, were also struggling with isolation before this happened. And I think the pandemic has really revealed like a significant crisis in our senior care. But I think for a lot of people, the way that they're coping, like, we go to technology, but I think seniors have been really activating like phone line chains and things like that. So the way that people like cope are differently. But I also think it's really interesting the way that we're not all participating in the same narrative now. So like I'm getting all my news from like Twitter and social media, where my grandma, for example, is only getting it from news on her TV, which I don't even see anymore. So we're not talking, we're not in the same place, we can't hug, and we're not even part of the same social narrative anymore. And I think it's creating like a lot of distance. So I think reaching out to the seniors that you have in your life and creating that connection as much as possible, whether it's about the news or jokes, or, you know, like my grandma was helping me identify the flowers in my garden that I have no idea what they are, and like really utilizing that talent. And it's really important, like, I think, to recognize, like, everybody has a mental health at every age, and like a lot of the older people in my life have this attitude of we gotta like toughen up and suck it up and push through. But this is something new and different. We can't tough it up and suck it up and just like tough this through. It doesn't work like that. We're stuck at home and have been stuck at home for a long time, and that requires like a lot of patience and self-care and love, kind of the opposite vibe a little bit. And I think we also need to recognize that for many of us, we're coming out of the pandemic and having our circle of 10. But for many seniors, that's not the case. Like, there's still a lot of isolation, a lot of fear. And so we might feel a lot of relief, but we have to remember not to leave them behind.
Thank you, Washington. Do any of our panelists have something they'd like to add?
Just add, Rosie, that I would totally support what Wash has just described, and what we've seen in the formal mental health and addiction system is just a real drastic change to the baseline of mental health given this pandemic. There's not a single person who hasn't been disrupted, whose life hasn't been disrupted, who hasn't had losses, even if it's just the loss of your routine and normalcy, and everybody's cope with that very different. But this has also helped really create some empathy for what people with mental health and addictions issues struggle with, because everybody has felt it now through this pandemic. So it's created a different level of baseline, and also some empathy and compassion, which isn't a bad thing either.
Thank you, Helen. I know we often use the term, we've been stuck at home, and really we have been stuck at home. Someone mentioned to me once, I don't like how you guys use the word stuck at home. You should say you're safe at home. But we know that not everybody is safe at home. And the next question is for Lisa about this topic. Lisa, for some people staying at home, they're not safe. This is actually opening the door to more conflict and potentially harm. So how can couples and families manage these conflicts? What are some tips for conflict resolution?
Yeah, it's a great question, and definitely that is what we're seeing in the community right now. We have more couples reaching out for support virtually, and we also have more parents reaching out for support. And as Wash and Christine have already outlined, their families are just dealing with so many challenges right now that they're coming in with their cup overflowing rather than just full. And so with couples and families, we still have the opportunity to implement some tips and some routines in the home, to use this opportunity to be homebound, to set some new goals as families and as couples, to try to reduce conflict. And what we know and what we're hearing from people, I had a couple say to me a few weeks ago, I've spent more time with my partner in the last 3 months than I have in the last 3 years. And whether or not it was an exaggeration, I'm sure it certainly feels like that to a lot of us, that we're having to learn all of these new interactions with our immediate family. And we could do a whole weekend on just on couples communication and strategies for conflict reduction. But what I've done is kind of broken it down into 4 areas that I think if we all practice, we can make some improvement to this situation. And one is our own self-awareness. Recognizing what our triggers are, recognizing our own body language, recognizing we're climbing our own mountain, and the way we perceive things, that we're hyper aroused. And so, something that someone might say with good intention, we might hear in a different way just because of the emotional state and everything we're balancing. But also when we're trying to communicate to others, it can lead to conflict, and we can be left thinking, what did I do or what did I say to set that off? But just having that compassion and that recognition in others that we're all balancing this and balancing lots, and more, as you've said, more than anything that we've ever experienced in our lifetime. And so we're not coming into interactions with any normalcy right now. We're coming into interactions all carrying a heavy load. And what we have found is that if we can own our own reaction and do the best we can to manage it, and recognize that we're entering into challenges within our relationships and with our family that are going to be heightened, and just putting strategies into place to de-escalate. And so what a lot of families have found helpful through this is what we call rules of engagement. So if we're going to engage in a disagreement, or if we're going to go there and have this argument, what are those rules? And families have sat down, they came up with these rules. What's fair fighting? What's off limits? And we've had some families write it out on a piece of paper, sign it, post it on their fridge, or put it in a picture frame on their table. And it's just simple understandings of, we're going to try to be kind wherever possible. We're not going to use demeaning language. We're going to let each other finish their sentence. But most importantly, knowing when to disengage. So knowing when to pick and choose our battles. And we all know our own triggers, or how our own buttons are pushed. We also know how our family members generally are triggered. And we can always ask that very simple question to ourselves: if I go there, is this going to be helpful or harmful to trying to de-escalate this conflict? So if I know my teenager, you know, saying a certain thing is going to set him off more, even if I'm frustrated with him, if I choose to go there, then I'm contributing to escalating the situation. So I've got to own my reaction. And at a time when so many things are out of our control, feeling that we can manage and control our own input to a situation, our own contribution to a solution rather than a problem, can feel like we have some capacity to reduce the conflict. The other big thing is going to be no surprise to anyone is about communication. So communication, we have all this extra time on our hands interacting with each other and using those opportunities to utilize the communication to express to each other what our needs are. So the needs we usually get met by having independence in our relationships. We know healthy relationships, there's an opportunity to be independent. There's an opportunity to have a social connections outside of our immediate family. But as a result of being home safe together, we have become enmeshed, and that can be and codependent on each other in many ways, and that can lead to unsafe interactions in the home where people are feeling hurt, and in some cases it does lead to interactions that would be abusive, whether emotionally, physically, sexually, and leaving family members as a result of being victimized by the conflict when it escalates to a certain point. And so the preventative strategies that families can put in place and practice and become habitual within that family as a preventative strategy is great. And then when it leads to those circumstances where it has escalated, as a community, us all knowing what the signs and symptoms are so we can recognize it in neighbors, recognize it in friends and siblings and in the community, but also do that self-assessment ourselves and know when has it went from conflict to abusive and power and control interactions in a relationship, and knowing how to access those resources. We often talk about the negative connotation of conflict, but conflict can also be a catalyst for change in relationships and families. And if we can look at conflict as a way that people are speaking up saying, I'm not okay with this situation, or I'm not okay with what's happening in the relationship. And we can embrace that conflict and choose healthy ways through communication, through goal setting together. As a couple, we want to do more of this. As a couple, we want to reduce the amount of arguments. And if I'm entering into every situation with that goal saying, is my action in this interaction going to achieve that goal? Then we can make progress as couples and families at reducing conflict.
Thank you, Lisa. Do our other panelists have something they would like to add? All right. And for those of you joining us tonight, again, a reminder that if you have a question for one of our panelists, feel free to jot it down in the chat portion. I saw one that came up for Washington, so we will get to that at the end. For now, I'd like to bring in Helen. Helen, question for you: managing grief and loss right now, whether you are dealing with a loss in the family or whether you're a frontline worker.
Great question, Rosie. And it's challenging. Through the pandemic, there's lots of losses, right? There's just the regular losses that we experience because we've lost our routines, our normalcy, going to work. We've just lost the basic things that bring us joy, like the ability to hug people that we love and are close to. So there are lots of layers to it. And then on top of that, we have had kind of the regular deaths of people who have passed that we are close to, and not being able to grieve them in ways that we normally would, the rituals that we have. And then of course, we've had losses connected to COVID-19, to the pandemic. So layers and layers and layers for us to sort through and work through. And what we know is that it's been really difficult to mourn through the pandemic because of the physical distancing and the isolation that people feel. One of the things that encourages grief, the expression of grief, is when we come together and when we're able to give those hugs and celebrate someone's life and their journey and what they've contributed. It's such a comfort to the family that's grieving. So we've had to do that very, very differently through the pandemic, and it's been very, very challenging. And it brings up different feelings. I know there's been a lot of guilt that families have felt when you think of those really, really sad and tragic deaths, for example, in some of the long-term care homes. And families haven't been able to be with their loved one, and they haven't been able to say goodbye and hold their hand in those last moments. There's a lack of closure that people feel, and just a lot of feelings of depression and just deep sadness. So again, without some of the regular ways to mourn, those layers become even more complicated. And we know that people grieve very differently to begin with, right? So when you look at healthcare workers, it's been really challenging for our healthcare workforce. Again, whether you're a doctor, a nurse, somebody who works in the food services area of a hospital, a cleaner, doesn't really matter what you're doing. There are many people who are keeping our healthcare system running and working. And this pandemic has been particularly challenging and putting them in such really extreme work situations. And many of our healthcare workers have experienced grief firsthand. When you think, for example, of nurses or personal support workers who work in long-term care homes and retirement homes, they've lost many of their residents. They've had to say goodbye to them. Some of their colleagues have become ill. So it's really, really been very, very challenging. I've heard someone talk about it as, because it's complicated grief, that they feel that their grief is suspended because they haven't really been able to express it. And they're feeling like they're holding a lot. And of course, during this pandemic, we're all holding a lot because, as we've all talked about tonight, we've never been in this space before, and we're all going through it together. And it is really challenging with lots of layers, and working from home and having your kids at home and worrying about your aging parents, and even just going to the grocery store as a production during a pandemic. So there's lots there for us to think about. Having said all that, there are definitely ways to grieve during a pandemic. It might look a little different, it might feel a little different, but there are definitely ways to be therapeutic about it. And I think Lisa mentioned this, it's really important to focus on what we have control over. During a pandemic, we have lost control over so many other things that we really need to focus on what we actually can do rather than the things that we can't do. And giving someone that permission and that ability to honor the person that they've loved, or to honor another loss that they've had in another way, and find ways to do that. You can, for example, congregate virtually. We're all here tonight on Zoom. We're all connected and talking with each other. There's ways that you can honor someone's life or journey through Zoom, right? You can pull people together. You can do some storytelling. You can do a photo book. You can share those things. There are many ways that you can honor someone and express that grief. You can certainly also plan an event later. So there's ways that you can do this and connect with people and share your grief and invite people in to share their stories. But you can also plan for something in a few months from now and know that you've got that marker there to either look forward to, or to know that you have a time that you can express that grief so that you don't have to hold it. I think that's really important. I think the other thing is, it's just really important to connect with people that you trust and that you care about. The informal support system is so important when you're grieving. Just good family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, all who know that you've lost someone or something that's been very important to you, or just some of the losses through the pandemic. Having someone share that with you makes the load a little bit lighter, and being able to go for a walk with someone, pick up the phone and talk to somebody, write them a text or an email sharing your thoughts is also a great way to express that as well. I think most importantly too, to give yourself grace and not guilt. For some reason, grieving brings up a lot of guilt. We think about the things we could have and should have and would have. And those are things that actually get in the way of us grieving. So just to really be kind to yourself and give yourself grace is important. The last thing I'll say is it's important, as I've mentioned, to reach out and connect with people when you're grieving, but it's also important for us to be aware of people that we need to reach in. Sometimes with grief, people can pull away, they can isolate themselves, they can build walls around themselves, and especially during a pandemic, those walls are really reinforced with physical distancing guidelines and all kinds of other restrictions that we have. Keep your eye out for people that you know about, that you care about, that you know have suffered a loss, because those people are people we want to keep an eye on and be able to do some reach-ins. There are tons of counseling centers here across our region. We're being hosted tonight by KW Counseling. They have amazing grief support. We have our hospice centers. We have lots of formal supports for people grieving, but make sure, again, you're doing that tap on the shoulder for people that need that informal support as well.
Thank you, Helen. Do any of our panelists have something that they would like to add? All right, then we'll move on to our next question. This is for Jen. Jen, how can the ways to mental well-being help us improve our self-care and our mental health?
Yeah, so something that Lisa and Helen have both touched on that I think is really important is the recognition that in life, things happen to us that are outside of our control. And I think this pandemic is just a really great example of something that globally we're all facing together that's quite outside of our control. But something I love about the ways to mental well-being is that it helps us to see what might be in our control in situations where other things are not. So KW Counseling has some great resources on this, but I'm just going to share a couple little tips for each of the ways to mental well-being that might be helpful. So the first way to mental well-being is connecting. And we know from the biggest research pieces that have ever been done on mental health that the biggest predictor of our long-term health and well-being is the quality of our relationships. And obviously that's been put to the test in this time and is a huge impactor on our mental health. But there are little ways every day that we can still maintain connection. So one of the things that I noticed early on in this pandemic is that people stopped looking at each other. You would walk down the street and people would put their heads down and avoid each other. And it was very, it was almost like we didn't want to even see each other anymore for the risk that that might pose. So one of the things that I've been doing and that I think is really valuable is just saying hello more often to people on the street. It's such a simple way to connect, but I've learned quite a few of my neighbors' names that I didn't know before. They may think I'm odd as I wave from the street as they're on their porch, hello, I live down there. But you know, that simple connection brings me so much joy in a day, just really looking at people in the eyes again and saying hi and asking them how they're doing. It's so small, but it's significant. So finding that connection again in the smallest ways is a great way to mental well-being. The second being active. So, I mean, for some of us, I think this has been a chance to slow down a bit and find more activity in our lives, more exercise. But for many people, exercise has really gone on the chopping block. So one of the things I like to think about with being active is that somewhere along the way, we decided that exercise was a chore, but our physical bodies as humans are made for exercise. We feel good when we move. Our muscles are meant to move. So one thing I always start with my patients is having them make a list of 10 ways that they like to be active. So maybe that's a walk or gardening, maybe it's a free online yoga class or whatever it is. And then each day they can choose from that list one way that they want to move their body. And we know that once we start to move our bodies, it can be like a ripple effect into the rest of our well-being. So we get that little boost of endorphins that helps us connect with other people. So exercising is a great way to stimulate the parts of our brain that help us form more meaningful connections with other people. So it's a great thing to do as a family, for example, or as we start to get to connect with people again. The third way to mental well-being is being mindful. So this is a great tool in an uncertain time, because mindfulness is helping us focus on the moment of what's happening instead of worrying about the future or being stuck in the past and what's happening. It really helps us to connect with the present moment. So whether that's sitting on the couch, you know, with your child watching TV, whatever it is, if we can be in that moment, we're much happier than if we're stuck worrying about what might happen in the future. So one easy tip that I really like for this one is to, you know, do it tomorrow. Walk through your day, and everything you do, give it a rating from +2, being +2 fills me with energy, or -2, that completely drained me. And so that you can get really mindful about what you're doing in a day and what that's doing to your energy and to your well-being. And what I love about this is it doesn't mean you have to make big and significant changes. It just means you've built a little more awareness around your activities in the day and what they're doing for your mental health. So for example, one of the times that I did this activity, I noticed that as I drove my kids around town multiple times, this was obviously pre-pandemic when they still had activities, I found that time in the car to completely drain me. And so instead, I can't change that I have to do that, but I can change what I do while I'm in the car. So whether that's playing uplifting music or listening to a podcast, I can, you know, change the things that I'm doing in a day without adding a lot to my life. So that's a great one. The fourth one, keep learning. This is so important too. And continuing to add new inputs really does broaden how you're thinking about the world. And then the fifth one, giving back. So, you know, this is something I think that's overlooked a lot, but it's very easy for us to get stuck in really thinking about ourselves, especially in something like the COVID-19 pandemic. And giving back is a way to shift our energy outside of ourselves and, you know, really give to other people. So simple acts of kindness, you know, one of the things that builds other people's coping skills is just encouraging them. So we know that people are much more likely to feel like they can take on challenges if they just get a little external encouragement from others. So that's a simple way to give back, is just encourage some of the people around you to do something that they've been wanting to do.
Thank you, Jen. That concludes our questions. We'll get to a couple of audience questions in a bit, but first I'd like to ask our panelists to share some of the resources that are available to people who are experiencing mental health challenges. And we'll start with Lisa.
There's, as we all know, there's lots of resources out in the community, and we do hear from people that they're inundated or overwhelmed with all of the resources. So a lot of community partners are coming together to try to build websites that have all the resources and that are easily to navigate. So Carizon for the Community has built a website that shares a lot of resources and tips, quick videos on mindfulness, quick parent tips on how to support your children to be resilient. The Counselling Collaborative has a website that we're updating with resources as well, apps that are available, different ways to contact all of the agencies, and Wellbeing Waterloo as well has a new website that is compiling all of the resources to be able to access very quickly. And that website is also translatable into multiple languages, so accessible.
Thanks, Lisa. And Helen, can you tell us about some of the resources available?
Sure. I mean, certainly all of our mental health and addictions agencies it's very easy. It's here 24/7. So it's 1-844-HERE-247. We have a website as well, here247.ca. We've also created a new program for our healthcare workforce through the pandemic called Here for Healthcare. And that has its own website. So www.hereforhealthcare.ca. And like Carizon, we also put a whole bunch of resources available for people through the pandemic as well, which is called hereforhelp.ca.
Thanks, Helen. And Jen.
Yeah, so thank you to all of you for the great resources that you provide for our community. From the Umbrella Project perspective, we like to try to work from a proactive, positive coping skill perspective. So on our website, you'll find lots of free resources about each of the coping skills. And we really try to help parents and families understand that small changes make big differences. So you don't have to pick everything. If you just pick one thing, pick one skill that you notice you might be lacking, like self-compassion if you're really hard on yourself or whatever it is, and just really focus on that one skill. And once you feel like that's coming along, focus on the next thing. So umbrellaproject.co is where all those free resources are for parents.
Thanks, Jen. And Christine, can you tell us about some resources?
Yeah, so we at the University of Waterloo, we have our Center for Mental Health Research and Treatment, and that's a service that provides assessment and treatment for children, adolescents, and adults, and it's low to no cost. And we have no wait lists at the moment. So if people, and so we're able to provide teletherapy at the moment. We're hoping that we'll be slowly able to start having visitors on campus again, but we need to wait for the university itself to open. But we certainly welcome referrals at this time, where we also provide comprehensive psychoeducational assessments at very low cost. So if one of the things that I think is a concern is that once this things start to normalize a little bit, there's going to be a backlog of issues that come when children who have been home now have to go back to school, and that's where we're going to see potentially children who are school avoidant now having a lot of trouble that they weren't having before. So anyway, we provide comprehensive assessment services as well as treatment services.
And finally, Washington.
So KW Counseling has a lot of great resources. So one of our experienced parents posted a link for parentingnow.ca. I don't know if other folks can see it, where parents can connect with other experienced parents to get some support. Of course, we offer counseling through video and phone. This includes single session counseling for folks who need to talk to somebody right away. The Okey program has an online youth group Tuesday evenings, so you can come together and connect with other youth. And on Monday, we're going to launch registration for a virtual youth camp day that folks, LGBTQ youth from grade 7 to 12 can access virtually July 9th.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pull up a couple of questions from our audience. The first one was for Washington. I'm just going to read part of it here. The question for Washington is, the pandemic has reduced the numbers of situations where members of vulnerable communities can do information sharing around navigating systems, and this has become especially problematic since the pandemic has changed how we navigate systems. So how can we help vulnerable communities deal with access to local systems that are vital to well-being? And again, that question was for Washington.
Yeah, so in the question I also talked about, like the example was for trans folks. So I'll speak to that a little bit. So in Waterloo Region, you know that trans folks will avoid the emergency room 25% of the time, even when they need it. And so like to access healthcare or mental health care, reach out and knowing that you're going to get the support that you need, that you're not going to get misgendered. There is this thing in the trans community called broken arm syndrome, where you go to access care at a doctor or for mental health professional too, and instead of focusing on the broken arm or the thing you want support about, instead they focus on your transness. And so in the trans community, it has become vital to people's survival to connect with other trans folks to figure out how to navigate that situation of like, I had a really good experience with this doctor, I had a really good experience with this therapist. And not having access to that community to share experiences and figure out like what's safe or not. Like if I go to this COVID testing center, like will I be misgendered? Like what was people's experience? And I think that's really vital in building people's confidence in accessing care and support services. So that's generally how I want to answer that question. I also want to acknowledge that you know, it's really stressful for everybody to have their medical appointments canceled. There are a lot of trans people who spent years trying to access the surgeries and supports that they needed, and they have been canceled because of the pandemic. And I'm sure that's also true for people who are waiting on other surgeries and care. And I just want to acknowledge that that is really hard and stressful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Washington. We have a question for Christine. The question is, how does anxiety affect our physiology, our emotions, attention, and internal dialogue?
So our anxiety, it's a threat response, and it's geared to prepare our body to flee or fight danger. So when we become anxious, a number of physiological changes happen. So the first thing is that we have adrenaline, and the adrenaline causes all sorts of internal sensations, which sometimes people don't really recognize as actually being part of anxiety. So what happens is that the adrenaline, first thing is it redirects blood flow. So it takes blood flow away from the extremities and puts it towards the large muscle groups. And that's to help us prepare the muscles to flee or fight danger or maximize their potential. And what's interesting is it can leave our hands and feet feeling very cold and our hands feeling very tingly. And so, you know, the expression cold feet, well, that's where that comes from. And so some people might find their hands tingling and be worried that it's actually something quite serious, but it's part of the anxiety. So the response also increases our breathing, it increases our heart rate, it causes us to perspire, and it also can make us, in increasing breathing, make us quite lightheaded and make us feel a little bit faint or dizzy. And so we can start to panic and think, oh my goodness, what's happening? But not realizing that all of those symptoms are actually part of the anxiety response. But the other thing that people may not realize that anxiety does is it organizes our attentional system. So it focuses like laser beam onto threat. And so we're very, very focused on threat cues or potential threat cues. And one thing that's interesting about our consciousness is that we're actually not great multitaskers. So we tend to be able to focus on mostly one thing at a time. So when we're focused on threat, we're not focused on safety. And so in COVID, for example, one thing, I was speaking with somebody the other day who was getting extremely anxious and agitated going to the grocery store because she would sit in her car and her husband would go in and get groceries. And she would see everybody who wasn't wearing a mask. And this would get her so angry and upset and anxious. But what she wasn't noticing is that a lot of people were wearing masks. Most people were social distancing. Her husband was social distancing. Even if there was somebody near him without a mask, he was able to maneuver. So all of that information that signals safety was not really penetrating attentional threshold. And that's part of the anxiety response that we may not be very aware of. And that also plays a role in the information that we seek out. So when we're anxious, we tend to go looking to try to get information and figure out how to handle the threat. And so we just keep digging and digging at threat. And again, we don't tend to notice the other information. So one of the things that's important to do is to override that anxious response and take that mental step backward and say, okay, I'm aware of threat. So this is part of the mindfulness. I'm aware there's threat. What else is happening? And what is a more balanced view of what's happening out there?
Thank you for that answer. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us tonight. I think we're nearing the end of our session, so I'm going to turn things over to Rebecca for some final remarks.
Thank you for that, Rosie. So I realize we've taken most of your hour. There's just a couple of minutes left, and we have committed, and we've been pretty good about finishing these sort of within the hour and ending up on time. So thank you very much to everyone who's joined us and participated in this conversation over the chat and has just joined in to these panel discussions. I did want to thank our panelists this evening for sharing just some really concrete pieces of advice and support and your wisdom professionally, but also I think I heard all of you speak from a very human and a very personal space. because this is something that everyone who you're seeing on the screen right now is also experiencing and is also going through. So I want to thank you for some of that sort of vulnerability also, and for sharing that. Rosie, thank you very much for taking on this role as moderator for these panel discussions. You have been an absolute gift, and we've so enjoyed working with you on doing these. We hope the discussions have been helpful for our community, and we're open to suggestions on what we as an agency could be doing right now. If people want to email me or get in touch with KW Counselling Services on other things you'd like to see as we navigate this and the next thing together, then please do reach out to do so. I do want to let you know that the attendees of this panel, so if you've joined us tonight and you've registered, then we'll be sending out a follow-up email with links to the organizations that you've heard from tonight. So it'll be, I know we talked about some of the resources, some of that we perforce went through pretty quickly, but we'll be able to connect you with some of those links and some of those resources and ideas and a little bit of direction if there's something you want to follow up on a little bit more. And if you want to connect with the organizations directly, they all do some great work. And if you want to know more about their stories and more about their history, and if you want to support them financially, I'm sure none of them would say no. Because it's a funny time we're going through right now. So I will leave that to you to take or leave as you will. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we'll be in touch with everyone after this is over.